Sometimes being able to speak the lingo is what's going to be necessary for your success. And lingo in campus area networking often involves device numbers, device types. Oh, I got a 2960 here. I got a 6500 or a 6800 there. What does that mean to us? Well, this is a really concise picture of what you might use at the certain layers of the three-layer hierarchical model. And let's start off with the access layer. Now, when we talk about the 2960s, these are access layer switches through and through. What do we mean by that? Well, if I'm looking at a 2960, and we've got one for you right now, this device is really only applicable to the access layer, and there's a reason why. It's layer 2 only. We can configure an IP address on a singular SVI. We would need to be able to configure an IP address on multiple SVIs in order to provide routing. So this is a layer 2 device through and through. And if we look at the front-hand side of it, we see some fast Ethernet ports. On the right side of it, these are gigabit ports that we use as an uplink to our distribution layer devices. And if we look at the other side, we get to see a really pretty picture of some of the labels and a mode button that indicates how the LEDs on the ports are going to display for us, which aren't lighting up right now because we are not supplying power to this chassis. So, that said, let's go back and look at some of the other devices that might live at the access layer. A 3850. Now, 3850s are pretty new, but you might find something like 3550s, 3750s, and we're all talking about the Catalyst switches. Catalyst being the Ethernet-specific switching chassis for Cisco. Nexus switches could potentially live here, but it would be a misallocation typically because they're focused on storage area networking. There's some older switches that we're probably not going to find anymore, like 2924s, 2948s, 3524s, 3548s. Stay away from those 24 or 48 at the end of a 29 or 3500, especially if it has an XL. Those are really old switches. By the way, 2500s still are very applicable here. They're just kind of older, and they're end of life. Okay, moving up to the distribution layer. At the distribution layer, we might have a 3550. Well, what's the look of a 3550, and how might that be different? Well, let's go back and take a look at a 3550. And here we have a few 3550s. And they don't always have the large number of ports that you see here. They might have fewer ports. But they also have the ability to stack, which is great, so that these can combine logically and serve as a single point of configuration. And it's also redundant configuration as well. So you can see some stack cables, and then you see what are likely going to be gigabit ports that are going to go down potentially to the access layer, and then some TE ports, 10 gig ports, that will be useful when you're connecting up to the core. So that's a 3750, but it's really similar to the 3850s, kind of same applicability. Very common distribution layer devices. Also the 4500s, which starts to get into kind of the meatier chassis, and there's something that's conspicuously absent here. And the conspicuously absent chassis is the 6500. Now the 6500 is still, I'm going to say, alive and well. Now, what's the exact state of it being sold? That's another thing. But the 38 or the 6500s We have a CCIE on staff who had one in his home, and he'd always call it the box that rocks. And that's Kevin Wallace, by the way. And you know what? They're awesome chassis. They give us a large number of ports, so we have a massive port density in the blades that we can sink inside of the chassis. We have redundancy inside of the power supplies and fan modules. All those sorts of things are really appropriate. Now, what's interesting is the 6500s and 6800s could find their way to a different place. You might use them at the access layer for their port density. It might be mildly untraditional, but it's not massively surprising to find these move around. But I will say this, these are kind of the de facto places for it. It's definitely possible to see 6500 and 6800s also living at the distribution layer. So don't go, oh, you can't use it there because that's a core layer switch. No, there's flexibility, and you're going to think about your needs in terms of port density, speed of connectivity, and feature support, and then you're going to find what works best for you. The one thing I will say is the 2900s, well, they're one-trick ponies. They're only applicable in the access layer.